I am not kidding when I say there is nothing better than spending a day at the beach, listening to the sounds of the ocean, the wind blowing through my hair, the sweet smell of seawater. I could stay here for the rest of my life. Couldn't you? Thrive Loud listeners, it is summer and we are ready to thrive. So break out your sunnies and SPF 30, hit the grill, the beach, the pool, the boat, and while you're doing all of this, be sure you are cranking up Thrive Loud. This summer is packed full with 3 to 4 episodes a week, lots of awesome minisodes, and even more celebrities, entrepreneurs, CEOs, you name it, we got it. Make Thrive Loud your ultimate podcast destination all summer long. We promise you will not be disappointed. And stay tuned for new and exciting things coming soon to Thrive Loud.
Get ready to Thrive Loud with Lou Diamond.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Thrive Loud with Lou Diamond, connecting you to the most inspiring and amazing people that are thriving each and every day. Today on Thrive Loud, I'll summarize it real quickly. Out-of-the-box thinker, a Forbes innovation keynote speaker, someone that's focused on the experiential, interactive, and engaging way you can be with your audience. He was voted top 10 global innovation keynote speaker by Speaking.com and keynotes at major international conferences and Fortune 500 companies. He is an expert in innovation that integrates exponential technologies and out-of-the-box thinking and methodologies to create breakthrough new innovations for organizations. Thrive Loud listeners, I'm going to have a lot of fun today because I love innovative thinkers who are out of the box. The managing partner at Amyx Ventures, the Scott Amyx. Scott, how are you today?
Hey, Lou. How are you? Thank you for having me.
It's always a pleasure to talk to a fellow speaker, but one that really is driven on thinking and innovating forward. I want to understand a little bit about you and let our listeners also learn. So if you could, Scott, kind of give a little bit of the quick rewind button just to give the fast track to how we got to what we're focused on doing today. Sound good?
Yeah. So I will start with a story. When I was young, I didn't have siblings, and my mom had to work full time. So this was when I was probably, I think, in kindergarten or first grade. So she literally would lock me up in our little one-bedroom apartment in South Korea, and I could not leave the house. I couldn't play with my friends, and back then, I didn't have easy access to the library. So here I am by myself after school in K through 12. And finding that only thing I have is my imagination. So I've learned to really hone and focus on imagination and particularly scenario planning. One of the things that I've done is I've taken that knack for forecasting and really crystallizing the future, the next 3 to 5 years, into something that's very tangible. So one of the things that I don't do is I'm not just simply talking about the future for the sake of it as a futurist, but rather I try to be very tactical, but also strategic. So I focus on what are the key mega trends that's happening from a corporate or from an enterprise perspective, and what do they need to start doing now to anticipate that and to create something of a new product or a new product line or new business line that they need to consider that can potentially replace their existing cash flow and provide a next multi-billion-dollar business.
Scott, I want to ask this question because I thought about this recently at a conference that was focused on innovation. Do you think companies are prepared to innovate and think forward at the time that they decide to make that decision? Or do you think that companies feel the need that they need to innovate to keep up? More often than not, I'm wanting to get your perspective on the difference between the two.
Well, if you look at studies show, and I was just looking at a technical journal just the other week, is that it is actually healthy for corporate entities to feel the heat from their competition. If they're feeling that competition, not only from their existing competitors, but from new entrants, that's bringing new business models and new technologies, it's actually positive. It forces them to stay on top of their game and to ensure that they not only retain, but to grow their market share. Now, with that said, fundamentally, when we talk about innovation, at the core of it, aside from the many methodologies that can be employed, is that it's about mindset. So sometimes I will present at some of these conferences and events and workshops, and I will hear at the end murmuring at the back of the conference room, somebody saying, "I hope that I die or retire before this happens." And this is a very common reaction by people. And one of the biggest challenge, and we've seen this, if there's statistics that show the incredible turnover within CXOs, in particular CEOs, because they cannot get the rest of the organization to align to the fact that they need to innovate or die.
It is true, by the way. Like, I think the problem that organizations have is every day you're always innovating, and it's just the pace at which you are on the path to do so. There's a lot of regular work you need to do, or you're doing a business a certain way. And obviously when you start to make sales or profit, you know that you're doing something right. And then there's that point where you recognize you might need to focus on expediting towards that change. That comment you made about, "I hope I die before that happens," is just, that's the overwhelmingness and the fear around having to make a change. How do you help companies or audiences that you speak to recognize how to balance that, thinking forward about the future, but also making sure you stay present in the moment and maximize the opportunity at that time?
Well, I think those are reality. So for those of us that's been in the workforce for many years, we've seen many large companies, so like some Microsoft, IBM, Dell, and others that have laid off tens of thousands of people. You see, what happens is the very people that oftentimes vocalize that, "Hey, I don't want this," or we shouldn't adopt, or we shouldn't change the direction of our company, are actually the first ones to leave, right? It's those people. So I went to I've been a speaker with IBM for many years, and I remember seeing one year all these older guys in the server mainframe business, and the next year I didn't see any of them, right? So if they don't embrace new approaches, new methods, new technologies, they find themselves outdated. And they are themselves actually accelerating their own demise.
Right. I'm just remembering this. This goes way back, and it's so funny. When I first started the workforce, I actually worked for what is now Accenture, and it was Andersen Consulting at the time. And one of the big business areas that they dealt with in the late 80s and early 90s was outsourcing technologies to exactly like the people who were working in the servers or those other areas. The consulting companies would kind of take those people in and then operate these larger companies in that regard as newer technologies were being developed, because you needed to keep the store lights on and running while you were trying to figure out how to adapt to new change. What I remembered most about that was a lot of those technologies were older, but what was so undervalued was how much information the people who were involved in that group actually had. So there was a huge focus for Andersen Consulting, Accenture, to innovate the skills of those that had, who'd been working on those older technologies. I guess the quick question is, obviously companies need to innovate all the time. How can people take your innovation message and learn that they can incorporate it for their own skill sets to innovate and adapt?
Yeah, so one of the articles that I wrote on Forbes recently is around this notion of how can companies innovate consistently. And it's an interesting notion because, the very vernacular thinking outside of the box, can we really truly do it? Oftentimes we find that from a research space, it's actually very difficult to innovate outside of the box. And why is that the case? Because the sheer nature that most of us are respective subject matter experts in our respective fields means that we tend to think from that point of view. So this particular research and methodology that I talk about in this article on Forbes is the fact that when we talk about creation of let's say a new product or a new business unit, or maybe it's a new startup, it's easy for us to be very much fixated on that problem or solution that we're trying to create, Rather, this model of symbiosis of human-machine innovation shows us that we can actually start to break down a big problem into small pieces and to focus on the small pieces and to incorporate crowdsourcing and AI to be able to actually consistently and systematically increase the profoundness of the innovation that we can come up with. And this is not something to do with an individual skill. Matter of fact, you can actually start to incorporate non-subject matter experts, domain experts into the process, yet still generate mounds and mounds of exponentially new profound insights that frankly wasn't available before.
And I know this, I've actually been to a couple of those IBM Futurist events. We even had our very first guest of Thrive Loud, Billy Howard. I think you guys actually were there the same year at one of the Futurist events. I know they have a lot of speakers at those conferences. Always thinking about how you could look forward and balancing the two together. I wanted to hit you though with a question from the side of how you're working with companies and thinking about how they're looking at change. Biggest problem that you are seeing today as it relates to companies challenging themselves or having the challenge of trying to innovate?
Well, I think let me give you an example. I'll give the example of if you're familiar with Amazon's proprietary R&D group called Lab 126.
I'm not. Share more.
Yeah. So there are lots of different books and studies that shows what really requires for an organization to have that consistent innovation. So if you look at them, they certainly, have all the check marks, right? In terms of, things like being independent, having their own budgets, the fact that they can allow for failure, but with discipline and so forth. But one of the things that I think a fault that organizations tend to have is that they start with requirements gathering. And I'm sure with your background at Accenture, that is a very common approach. But what I assert is that actually that is not where you want to start with. So give you an example. You're familiar with Square, which is a e-commerce POS system. So if you're a existing player in that space, when you think about product innovation, you're thinking about kind of the next set of features, but more or less it's the same thing, right? Whereas Square and new entrants are thinking about it entirely different. So coming back to the Amazon example, in 2010, when Lab 126 was working on the secret project, no one from a customer perspective said, I want this. What they were tasked to build was something along the lines of augmented reality, holographic like display, where users can interact with it through hand gestures and speech. Now, by 2014, they had refined it and kind of scoped out AR to just focus on the natural language speech component of it. And that's what eventually became Amazon Echo and what we know as Amazon Alexa. But the point of that is, if you take a traditional approach of tell us what you want, they will tell you what they want from today's perspective. Your customers, whether it's internal or external, can only look at it from that point of view. They cannot think of what is needed in the future, what can be even conjecture. So one of the ways that we can get around this artificial constraint is instead of looking at it from what are the functional or the technical requirements for this new product or service, we have to ask our target customers from the point of benefits-oriented requirements. It's a benefits requirements abstraction. And before we get too granular, we want to abstract it out. So for example, for Amazon, they're not asking customers, what should we build? But what are you trying to achieve from a benefit? So some of the things that's important for Amazon customers are buy high quality products at the lowest possible price. And that's never going to change. The other thing is making a purchase or reorder should be as easy as possible. And when you order something, you want it to be delivered as soon as possible. And lastly, you don't want to have to pay, or it should be very little to pay for shipping costs. So one of the principles is learning to innovate on behalf of your customers or your target segments. So Amazon, instead of just simply asking what the customers wanted, they innovated on their behalf. So in the case of requirements of, we want high quality products at the lowest price, one of the things that Amazon did was they introduced third-party sellers. And they created this robust marketplace where sellers could compete and bring the highest quality products at the lowest possible price. Whereas a traditional approach would have led to companies just simply buying larger bulk and negotiating better terms. Another example of this is making purchases or reorders as easy as possible. So Amazon, what they did was they launched one-click purchase on your phone, on your mobile app, but they also launched Amazon Alexa, and that API is now available everywhere. It's enabling lights, it's enabling gadgets, and even toilets. I mean, it's incredible. And they have these dash buttons. So if you want to reorder your detergent, you just simply push a button in your laundry room. Amazon Go, check out free stores. These are examples of things that they have done on behalf of customers. Whereas if you let companies take the traditional approach, they would have simply streamlined their app workflow or introduce some monthly subscription as an example.
That's great.
One more example is I want my orders delivered to me as soon as possible with almost zero shipping costs. Amazon unveiled Prime Now. So now I can get things within 2 hours on the same day, depending on where you live. They have Amazon Fresh that delivers groceries right to your door. And they're launching Prime Air Drone Delivery. And their warehouses are some of the most automated facilities in the world with swarms of autonomous robots fulfilling orders. Now, again, if you've taken a traditional approach, most companies would have optimized their current supply chain and logistics and maybe consider outsourcing delivery to shared economy drivers. So the point there is we have to kind of rethink the approach. And a lot of what I'm bringing to the clients are research-based, fact-based methodologies and best practices that frankly isn't readily available out there.
Scott, I love the summary of that. Thank you for sharing that. This was great. I wanted to jump in. I love the concept of that people today in the environment they're currently in only are focused on what they want, but not knowing what the future will bring and understanding what they need. And I love that component because isn't that always the case, right? We always kind of figure out what we want, but not necessarily get what we need. And that's actually really true. And what you just described in the innovative way to think about that is really clear, pretty impressive, obviously, of how they thought about all these things. And yet scary at all the same times because all change does that because it's our familiarity and how we adapt. I want to flip the tables or flip the script a little bit and get under the hood of Scott Amyx's mind and brain and understand a little about him. And Scott, if you've listened to the show, I know I ask my guests on this program, you're a great speaker, a very smart innovator, a great consultant and futurist in innovation, but we all have our off days. When you have trouble thriving, who or what practice do you seek to help get yourself back on the thriving track?
That's a great question. And I've been interviewed on this topic before, but let me actually just back up and give you a little bit of story. When I was in college, I started to take martial arts, Taekwondo in particular, and I fell in love with that sport from day one. And it was interesting because people used to ask me in college, are you majoring in economics or are you majoring in Taekwondo? Because I was taking so many classes. Well, I loved it so much and I wanted to continue, but by the time I got to graduate school, I just couldn't fit it into everything else. And it was so difficult to manage my workload at the University of Chicago that I just couldn't handle anything else. So I dropped it. Well, fast forward 20 years, my son, who is going to be turning 13 in just a few months, I told him about a year ago, I said, look, if you make it to black belts, I will actually train with you. And guess what? He made it to black belt. Okay. And I have to tell you, I was a little bit frightened because these old bones haven't done any type of martial arts or any real stretching or kicking for 20 years. But I needed to follow through. And I wanted to commit. So now we've been practicing together. He's a black belt and I'm a black belt and we're working towards a 2nd degree black belt. And coming back to your question is, the reason this is important is all of us have our off days. All of us. But there are coping mechanisms that I try to employ. And certainly that's something that I try to share and to develop for my kids, a toolkit, because I don't drink alcohol. I don't smoke. I don't even drink coffee. I do partake in tea, but it's mostly water. And I'm incredibly healthy. I'm, flexitarian, mostly on the vegetarian side. So I try my best. But one of the important pieces of it is, at least for me, is exercise. So when I am stressed or when I'm down or when I'm not at my best, but I go and work out and put in that hour plus at the gym, at the studio, and I'm just soaking wet. And it's interesting because I actually have to wear those headbands around my head. I wear 2 because I sweat that much. And when my kids see me wring it out and there's literally half a cup of water, they know that I had a good workout. But afterwards, it's quiet. There's silence. And that is one of the most important feelings that one can have, is this notion of quietness and peace. Because so many times, there's so many distractions and things that concerns and worries us that we're just constantly being bombarded and we can't address one after another. But when we allow ourselves exercise, and I talk about meditation in another podcast, I talk about the benefit of meditation. So if possible, in addition to Taekwondo, I do my lifting and my meditation in the morning. And that half an hour to an hour that I spend at 6 or 7 in the morning pays dividends on the back end. My productivity enhances. My mind is clearer. My mood is better. And the other thing is, I used to be a workaholic. I still am, but I'm a different kind of workaholic. Is I used to work 10, 12 hours straight and not even get water or even use a restroom. So sure enough, by the time I was in my 30s, I had a herniated disc. And it got pretty severe where it warranted surgery. But I told myself, I'm going to change my lifestyle. So part of the way I actually mitigate the risk and the need for surgery is I have to exercise. And that includes lifting heavy weights as well as the Taekwondo that I do now. So all of these things forces me to keep me sharp. But you're right. All of us have our down days. And when I really, really have a down day, and it's on my annual goals, is I have to, on a monthly basis, go to the forest. I literally have a numeric number where I assign it to myself. Have you gone to the forest? And for others that are not necessarily near or have accessibility to a forest, the key is that when we are immersed in nature, even if it's just your backyard and your grass, when we do that, there is there are endorphins and oxytocin and all these things that kick in that changes your chemistry within your brain, as well as not to mention all the other health benefits like vitamin D and so forth. So that is something that I learned personally from, the Scandinavians in Norway, Sweden, Finland. When I visit those countries, they take their forest and their nature very seriously. And I love to take my family to the forest on Sundays.
That's great. I love this. And well-rounded on all approaches. I was going to ask you now, just as a follow-up, are you going to progress further up the belts in martial arts, or just use it as an exercise?
I'm going to be a grandmaster. I'm going to be able to leap to the top of the mountain on a single bound.
This is not surprising for you, but I can totally see that. Just do me a favor. Just bring as many of those wrapped around bandanas or headbands on the stage the next time you're up there. See, just so you know, you have really good hair. Us guys who don't, we really need those things to absorb it because we got nothing else.
Actually, it's a toupee.
Okay. All right. So Scott, do me a favor. Let's do the admin part of the show here. Share with all the Thrive Lab listeners all the places people can find you, websites, links, upcoming events, things you're doing. We will provide it all in the show notes, but it always sounds better when it comes from you.
So on Instagram, it's Scott _Amyx, AMYX. On Twitter, it's Scott Amyx. And on LinkedIn, Scott Amyx. And you could just find me on a website by just simply typing in my name. And the best way to meet me is in person, because I think that one of the most important ways that we can impact one another is through relationships that are authentic.
I love that. Where are you based, Scott? Just what part of the country?
originally from Silicon Valley, but because of some breathing issues that I have, I relocated to the New York tri-state area. So I'm enjoying the four seasons, but not necessarily the tornadoes and the hurricanes.
For the Thrive Lab listeners who need to know this, we recorded this in very late May, and the New York tri-state area in the last week has been absolutely a minefield of weather craziness: tornadoes, hurricanes, storms, winds, incredible lightning storms, floods. Noah is collecting two of all kinds in the port of Brooklyn, I think, is where he's at. So stay tuned. Hopefully it clears up soon. With that being said, I've got a couple more Thrive Lab specific questions for you. Let's get the signature one out of the way, and then I've got one other follow-up here. Scott Amyx, your all-time favorite movie?
All-time favorite movie. Wow. You know, one of the things I realize is that storytelling is everything, no matter what your profession is. And if you can have the four elements of storytelling, which are fluency, right? The tension, the novelty, and then the relatability, it's powerful. So, you know, being that I'm a storyteller buff, I don't have one because I frankly have 100 or plus that are my favorites. I love stories. I'm a curator of stories. But I have to say, I'm very soft to those musicals.
I'm going to make you pick one.
Yeah. I love musicals. Rain on the Dance. There you go.
Oh, Dancing in the Rain.
Dancing in the Rain.
That is, Dancing in the Rain is a good one. And it's actually, it's fun because there's parts of it that were meant to be a little bit of a spoof of musicals, but they're just, the dance scenes are amazing. So, now I want to ask the question along the lines of storytelling. You obviously like telling stories, and you mentioned you have a young son or family. When you were telling, what's your favorite story to tell your children as you've been growing up?
Well, I think this is a PG-13 show, so I probably have to keep it fairly clean.
We've gone off the rails a lot. You can take it whatever level you want.
But I'll tell you something fairly clean, and that's also tied to my heritage. So I'm South Korean by ethnicity. And South Korea, just real quick, went through some very difficult times. So we were a colony of Japan for some 35, 40 years. And we couldn't even speak our language and have any resemblance of our culture for many years. And it was World War II that actually stopped that colonization, but we went right into a civil war. But anyways, South Korea, for the most part, at least the modern century, have been challenged with lots of difficulties. So one of the famous kind of story that I've kind of grew up with is this notion of a small village family. And the father, I think, is a farmer. And they've prepared a meal for the family. So everyone is sitting around their little dining table with their legs crossed. And they have a bowl of rice and their chopsticks. And their main meal is fish. But that fish is actually not on the table, but rather that fish is hanging from the ceiling. See, what they've done is, because they can't afford a lot of food, they've decided to cure or salt the fish, and excessively almost. And that salted fish is hanging from the ceiling, and they're simply visualizing and tasting that saltiness without actually eating it and then consuming rice. And that just shows you that sometimes, even when we have what we believe we have very little, or when we're working with the smallest constraints, those constraints forces us to be creative. If you ask me, how do you become an innovator is being able to work with constraints, capital constraints, resource constraints, talent constraints, market constraints, and still thriving and succeeding in ways that, frankly, your competitors couldn't have thought of.
Scott, I can't think of a better way to wrap up a show than fish hanging salted from the ceiling. Scott Amyx, thank you so much for coming on Thrive Loud, sharing your stories, and continue to help all those out there recognize how they can change their mindset and truly think about the future and the best innovations out there.
Thank you, Lou. Appreciate it.
And to all our Thrive Loud listeners out there, thank you for joining us. And until next time, keep thriving onward and upward. And remember, be brief, be bright, be gone.
You've been listening to Thrive Loud with Lou Diamond. Now that you've heard this amazing episode, you really need to subscribe and hear all our episodes. Head on over to thriveloud.com and subscribe on whatever platform you listen to your podcasts. And make sure to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn at Thrive Loud. Thanks for listening.